Before I start, you might have noticed I've been doing a fair few live streams on YouTube, and I've really enjoyed it. It's been great chatting with folks as I die repeatedly due to my own ineptitude, but I've decided to move the streaming to Twitch, mainly just to keep it separate from the YouTube channel. I don't want to be spamming people's notifications with live streams they have no interest in. But if you do feel like stopping by sometime and saying hi, I'll put a link to my Twitch channel below. Anyway, when I was in high school, I played trumpet in the school band, and I wasn't too bad at it. My technique was decent, my tone was okay, I could hit all the high notes, mostly. I had some skill. What I didn't have, however, was any sense of rhythm at all, and that made playing in an actual band kind of difficult. Even when I was carefully watching the conductor, I struggled to play the right notes at the right time. And when my focus drifted and I failed to pay attention, bad things happened. On one memorable occasion during a relatively important performance, I finished my solo and then realised with dawning horror that the rest of the band was a bar and a half behind. Or, more accurately, I was a bar and a half ahead. The audience, a group of bored primary school kids, and remember I did say the performance was only relatively important, didn't seem to notice, but the conductor and the rest of the band sure did. Now, given the fact I have no sense of rhythm, it may be surprising to learn that, for a while at least, rhythm games were probably my absolute favourite genre. Starting in the early 2000s and reaching a peak with the first few Guitar Hero games, I was almost obsessed with them. And, even more surprisingly, I was pretty good at them. I'm not saying I was great, I've never been great at any game, and once YouTube came around and showed me what real Guitar Hero pros were capable of, I realised that I barely qualified as pretty good. But I had some degree of competence, and before Guitar Hero brought the genre into the mainstream, I was better at rhythm games than just about anyone I knew. For many people, Parappa the Rapper may be the first game that comes to mind when thinking about rhythm games, or maybe games that had their origins in the arcades like Beatmania or Dance Dance Revolution. For me though, the first game that really got my pulse beating to a synth-heavy rhythm was a lesser-known title by the name of Frequency. When I bought it for the PS2 in the early 2000s, I was kind of taking a risk, as I knew very little about it, other than the fact it was a rhythm game, and that a writer in a games magazine, and yes, games magazines were still a thing back then, had nominated Frequency as the most difficult PS2 game thus far. I was only just entering my doddering old man phase at that time, so the notion of a challenging game still had some appeal, especially if it was a rhythm game. So I spent a significant portion of my acquired cash on a copy of Frequency. And boy howdy was I ever challenged. Fortunately, I was also instantly hooked on the game, so I didn't mind the time investment that was required. The control scheme was simple, but unlike anything I'd played before, and it required some serious mental adaptation. Basically, you're in an octagonal abstract tunnel kind of thing lined with 8 different tracks. As each gem, or note, passes through the green contraption at the bottom of the screen, you need to press L1, R1 or R2 depending on whether the gem is on the left, centre or right. If you do this successfully for every note in a 2-bar phrase, then that track will continue on automatically for a while, meaning you have to press left or right to switch to another track. If you can do this without missing a bar, your score multiplier increases. And that basically covers it. There are also power-ups for temporarily increasing your score multiplier or auto-activating a track, and if you manage to activate all available tracks you'll get a freestyle mode where you don't have to worry about hitting notes and can just mess around with adding extra synth or FX. Like I said, it's simple, but I found it hugely addictive. For me it really gets to the core of what a video game is, pressing buttons skillfully. And at higher difficulty levels, skill really is required. That said, I have to admit that most of this footage is me playing on easy mode, as I've really struggled with anything tougher this time around. This is partially due to my accelerated decrepitude, no doubt, but in all honesty it's mostly due to the fact I'm playing on an emulator, and I should point out I'm using my own legitimate copy of the game. The thing is, there's a significant discrepancy with the timing in this emulation, and for a rhythm game like this, timing is kind of important. There are options for adjusting audio-visual synchronization, but I haven't been able to dial it in perfectly, and even worse are the regular stutters and hitches during gameplay. I don't think even a great player, which I definitely no longer am, could cope with a half-second pause thrown in randomly during a complicated section. Even playing the game on a TV can be an issue, as frequency was released before options for adjusting output latency became commonplace. The game was designed for old-school CRT TVs, and I've often been tempted to hunt one down purely for frequency and its sequel, which we'll see in a little while. Regardless of these frustrations, Frequency is still a great game and a hell of a lot of fun. Once you get into the groove, it really felt like you weren't just playing along to the music, you were creating it, and the PS2 controller was a genuine musical instrument. It shouldn't be a surprise then that Harmonix, the creators of Frequency, took the notion of controller as instrument a step further when they created Guitar Hero. But even without the fake plastic guitar, I found myself entering a kind of flow state with Frequency that I've seldom experienced in any other game. And I really do mean that. One of the most memorable gaming experiences I've ever had, and maybe the highest my heart rate has ever risen while playing a game, came in the final seconds of a song in Frequency where I just needed to complete a tricky phrase in order to beat my personal best score. The adrenaline surged, I managed to pull it off, and I felt a massive sense of achievement. It would have seemed like absolutely nothing to an outside observer, and I'm sure many of you can't really see how pressing a bunch of buttons in time to music could be an enduring gaming memory, but in all seriousness, that was nearly 20 years ago now, and I can still remember the exhilaration and triumph very clearly. Of course, as with any rhythm game, or indeed any game where the music is a key focus, just how much you like that music is going to play a big role in how much enjoyment you can get out of the game. I'm not going to claim that the tracklist in Frequency is objectively good. I'm not sure objectivity has any real relevance to music anyway. But I will say that I like all of it and absolutely love most of it. I tend to prefer the synth-heavy electronica tracks, but some of the guitar-driven stuff works just as well with the gameplay. And that's the thing, the way in which the music synergizes with the gameplay is a key part of why Frequency is so good. Differences in musical styles mean differences in gameplay. A steady pulsing techno track has a different feel and requires a different touch on the controller than a hip-hop track filled with offbeats and complex syncopated rhythms. And there's a good variety in the music too. There are a few fairly well-known artists, such as No Doubt, Paul Oakenfold and Jungle Brothers, but my personal favourite tracks are mostly those written specifically for the game by Casson Crooker, who worked on the development of the game. He was also a member of Freeze Pop, who became a mascot of sorts for Harmonix, as they've appeared in Frequency and its sequels, as well as Guitar Hero and Rock Band. I sincerely regret that I can't show you those tracks because they're available on hard mode only, and I just can't get to them with this dodgy emulation. There's also a nifty little remix mode where you can pick any song and then lay down notes in any formation you wish. You can then actually save the result and play it just as you would any normal song. It's pretty limited, of course. The remixes are always going to sound just like chopped up versions of the original, but it's a pretty cool bonus feature. Anyway, as positive as I've been so far, Frequency does have some issues, although I only really noticed them once the sequel fixed most of them. When you successfully complete a phrase and activate a track, it plays automatically for a while and then comes back. But if that phrase repeats later on in the song, it will also be automatically activated then, provided you got it right first time round. I know that sounds confusing, but what it basically means is that if you do well at the beginning of a song, in some cases the latter half of the song will mostly play itself, leaving you with nothing to do except mess around on the freestyle tracks. On the flip side, there are songs where, if you're trying for the maximum score, which was the only way I ever played, you'll find yourself avoiding certain tracks altogether. You'll want to stick to the tracks that reward the most points, and that can mean you're just switching between the drum, bass and synth tracks, leaving the vocals and other effects untouched, leading to a song that sounds a bit samey. This isn't necessarily a bad thing. When you're playing the game, you're usually too focused to fully appreciate the music anyway, but the sequels did a better job of ensuring you fully explore the range of what each song has to offer. Also, the game isn't quite as responsive when switching tracks as you might hope for. I had no issue with it at the time, but the sequel really tightened things up in that respect, so that going back to Frequency felt like a bit of a struggle. And on the topic of that sequel, it's probably time to move on to Amplitude. Amplitude came out a couple of years after Frequency, and its gameplay is essentially the same, so I'll just go over the differences. The most significant of these is probably the fact that you're no longer in a tunnel. Now the tracks are laid out side by side on a sort of musical highway. This makes it a little easier to see and comprehend what's coming up, but on the other hand, it's a long trip from one side of the highway to the other. This potential problem is largely alleviated by the fact that there's a lot more consistency in how tracks come back into play after they've been activated. Now, when you successfully activate a track, they stay activated for a specific number of bars, and that number is just enough that, if you move from lane to lane without any mistakes, by the time you get from one side of the highway to the other, you'll have a bit of a gap to move back to the start and continue your combo. Of course, that's only possible with perfect play, so you won't be seeing much of that here. Also, there is some variation to this, particularly at the start of some songs, but with a bit of practice it's possible to come up with the optimal strategies and pathways through the song. And this is made easier by the fact that, as mentioned before, the controls are just a little snappier in Amplitude. Once you get the hang of it, you can move across quite large gaps in just a beat or two, which can really make you feel quite skillful. Or at least it did for me, which is obviously a rather rare occurrence. There are some minor graphical enhancements over the previous game in the series, largely due to the fact that Amplitude came on a DVD, whereas Frequency was one of the relatively few PS2 games to fit on a CD. The most obvious example of this is probably the video screens that appear in most songs, showing little snippets of the performers. You also get to create a little 3D avatar for yourself that jams along to the song, switching instruments as you switch tracks. I didn't bother customizing mine this time around, I just hit the random creation button, and ended up with a green-headed dude with cornrows, a goatee, and rather shapely breasts. Which is uncannily similar to how I look in real life, except in every possible way. Anyway, it seems a little messed up thanks to dodgy emulation. No great loss. There's a new freestyle power-up in Amplitude, which can be very handy. It lets you totally avoid difficult sections, and also acts as a kind of reset, as by the time it's done, every track will be ready to be activated again. If you're playing at the highest level, it's actually not that great, as you should be seeking out the difficult sections because they're the ones that give you the most points. But my days of playing at that level are far, far behind me. As for the soundtrack, I would say that on the whole Amplitude has an even better selection of tunes than Frequency. And there are some big names here like Run DMC, Weezer, and with possibly my favourite tune from the entire series, David Bowie. It's a remix, but in my opinion it's an incredible remix of an amazing, profoundly moving song. However, Amplitude also features my least favourite songs in the series, and as it happens they all come one after the other. I won't mention any names. What's worse, they all feature the one element where I think Amplitude takes a small step back from its prequel. In Frequency, you could choose which tunnel the music went through. Some were twistier and more elaborate than others, but one at least just went straight. And that's the one I preferred to use, as it eliminated the visual confusion that came with some of the sharper turns. In Amplitude, on the other hand, each song has its own specific highway with its own individual twists and turns, and you can't switch them around. And in this particular set of 3 songs, the twists can be rather extreme. At its worst, this makes it genuinely tough to tell if there's a half beat between notes or a whole beat. It's something you can learn to get used to, but I find it just to be an unnecessary irritation that makes these particular songs something I endure rather than enjoy. Now I need to mention the multiplayer element. There was a 2-player mode in Frequency as well, but it really became something rather cool in Amplitude. Basically, 2 players occupy the same highway, competing to get to the most complicated tracks, and therefore the highest score. There are several multiplayer specific power-ups, including one which bumps your opponent to another track, and one which distorts their part of the screen for a short time. With 2 similarly skilled players, it can get incredibly competitive. I had the opportunity to play occasionally with my nephews and it was a hell of a lot of fun. I started out dominating them of course, but it wasn't long before they really caught up. The last time I tried playing them, well, let us never speak of that. Amplitude was also playable online, but alas, that's something I never had the chance to do. Anyway, that's Amplitude. But it's not the end of this story because after nearly a decade and a half, Amplitude came back. It started, as so many amazing video game reboots have, with a Kickstarter campaign, one I gladly contributed to. And so my name's in the credits, one of my proudest achievements, and all I had to do was splash out a bit of cash. If only all pride could be so easily bought. Actually, I'd still be screwed because I don't have any money. Yeah, well. Anyway, what's changed in the 2016 remake of Amplitude? Well, display lag is no longer an issue, and since I'm able to play this one the way it was intended, I'm significantly better at it. Kind of. Thanks to everything being online these days, I know that my total score puts me in the top 3% of players, which I'm happy with. And there's now a campaign mode with an actual story, of sorts. It's not much of a story, consisting mainly of brief dialogue at the start of certain songs. And the voice acting, brief as it is, manages to explore the full range of terribleness.
I'm reading an elevated fear response. This experiment is failing.
She's not an experiment.
And the narrative isn't exactly compelling, something to do with healing a woman's traumatized brain through the power of, I don't know, fat beats or something. I didn't really pay much attention. The gameplay is largely unchanged. It is perhaps a little more forgiving with the timing, and switching lanes feels even more responsive. You're massively helped in this respect by the fact that now, when you want to switch lanes, a single button press will automatically take you to the next available lane. This certainly makes the game significantly easier, but I'm not 100% sure I like the change. Some of my favourite moments from the earlier games came when I managed to skillfully dash across a big gap. Ultimately though, my doddery old fingers are glad it's a bit easier. The tracks are again arranged in a tunnel formation as they were in Frequency, but now they're all duplicated 3 times. I guess I actually mean triplicated, so that the tunnel is much larger and more spaced out, which works better on widescreens and makes everything a little easier to see. But again, the crucial thing in a game like this is the music. And the music in the remake is fine, I guess. The 15 tracks in the campaign were all created specifically for the game, mostly in-house at Harmonix. And they're okay, but only 1 or 2 of them really stand out for me. The rest are all a bit samey, to my ear at least. There's more variety amongst the other tracks, which come from a variety of sources, including game composers, and in one case a Kickstarter backer. Actually, that song by the Kickstarter backer is one of my favourites in the game, largely because it's one of the few tracks that's both energetic and upbeat.
And the Milky Way was brighter than the sun. When I
Today.
share my sights and the words to let me try, and I am left with feelings only just begun.
The majority of the music in Amplitude 2016 is surprisingly tense. There are a lot of minor keys here. Even the obligatory freeze pop track is a departure from their usual cheerful sound. And there's a real lack of funk among the tracks on offer. Syncopation, hip-hop elements, jazzy beats and swing rhythms are almost non-existent. There's certainly nothing like Run DMC in this game. Ultimately, my favourite track has to be the one by Danny Baranowski from the excellent game Crypt of the Necrodancer. I love the tune, and it's the most interesting, the most fun, and one of the most challenging tracks in the game. On the whole then, the music's a little disappointing. I quite like almost all of it, but unlike the earlier games, there are just very few pieces I genuinely love. I think it's safe to say that if I still had a working CRT TV and a place to put it, I'd still be spending more time with Frequency and the older Amplitude than I would with the new one. Alas, it's currently my only real option if I want to get a hit of that classic Harmonix rhythm action, and it's not a bad one. It's just not quite everything it could have been. But it was absolutely worth backing on Kickstarter, no doubt. Well, thanks for watching. I know games like this are kind of a niche product, but there really was a time when they were simply my favourite games on the planet. And the music, at least in the first two games, was genuinely influential in shaping my musical taste for the new millennium. Anyway, until next time, get off my lawn.
Today,